Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. On this day, 75 years ago, in 1945, AJC made history at the United Nations Founding Conference in San Francisco, where it participated as one of the consultants to the United States delegation. As the UN now marks its 75th anniversary, we are honored to be joined today by two prominent former US ambassadors to the United Nations, John Negroponte, who served under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2004, and David Pressman, who served under President Barack Obama from 2014 to 2016. Ambassadors Negroponte and Pressman will be in conversation with Felice Gaer, director of the Blaustein Institute for the Advancement of Human Rights, to explore whether and how the UN can remain a key venue for enhanced US foreign affairs leadership. After we hear from Felice and our esteemed guests, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that is questions plural, or you can use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Felice, you and our guests have the floor.
Thank you very much and welcome. We're grateful to have Ambassadors Negroponte and Pressman here today as we mark the Charter's 75th anniversary. AJC has had a long-standing commitment to promote American global leadership in pursuit of our interests and values, including at the United Nations. These include seeking peace, security, and human rights for all. On this anniversary, AJC has released a new publication entitled Making a Difference, AJC's Advocacy for Human Rights in the United Nations Charter, which you can read on ajc.org. It recounts the decisive and historic role that AJC played at the San Francisco conference, where its consultants, Joseph Proskauer and Jacob Blaustein, persuaded a divided US delegation to press successfully to place protection of human rights at the core of the United Nations. America's relationship with the United Nations in the 75 years since has been complex. As former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said to AJC this week, at age 75, people and institutions need a little refurbishing. But that recalibration won't happen at the UN, she said, unless the United States is a key part of it. Ambassador Negroponte, I'd like to begin with a question for you. You took up your post at the UN in the immediate aftermath of the Durban World Conference on racism, and you served just days, you came in just days after 9/11. During your time, we saw deadly conflicts and atrocities in places like Liberia. The US undertook military action in Afghanistan and Iraq. Do you feel that the United Nations was effective in responding to these or other crises? And what was the US able to gain from having a global forum, the United Nations, in which to address these issues?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this important program. I think it's good that we recall the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I think it remains an important institution in our lives and in lives of the people around the world, even though it is 75 years old. And as has frequently been said, and it's a bit of a cliche, if the United Nations didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Now, as regards my time there, especially the beginning, which I got there about a week after the events of 9/11, I would say the United Nations, as a group of countries, had a mixed record in the ensuing period. But we we took some steps dealing with peacemaking, and particularly in Africa, sending peacekeeping forces to places like Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was a basket case when I first arrived at the United Nations, and the government barely controlled a few square blocks in downtown Freetown, the capital of that country. And within a matter of several years, the government, the legitimate government, had managed to extend its writ throughout the country. So that's just one example, without citing many, many others, of the kind of work in the field of peacekeeping where I think the United Nations has been effective. And I think it's saved a lot of the member states a lot of difficult decisions of their own as to whether they might have had to intervene unilaterally or otherwise if there hadn't been a United Nations around to be of assistance. Of course, the sort of 800-pound elephant in the room, if you will, during that period, during my tenure there, was the issue of Iraq. I probably spent a disproportionate amount of my time at debates on the subject of Iraq, and I think that it's an example of a situation where we were unable to effectively pursue our objectives within the United Nations, and that you could say that it was one of the less successful aspects of the George W. Bush foreign policy. But that notwithstanding, the UN still played quite an important role in Iraq, in the Oil for Food program, in the passing of many different resolutions after we had occupied Iraq to help guide the governance of Iraq and get more buy-in from the international community. So by and large, I would say that having the United Nations is a plus. It's not a panacea by any means, but it's a tool that's available to policymakers in our country and in other countries of the world. And it behooves us to take advantage and use that tool when it best serves our purposes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Pressman, you served at the UN at another crucial time. ISIS was taking advantage of the instability in Iraq and Syria and conducting terrorist beheadings. A brutal civil war was taking place in South Sudan. The Ebola crisis broke out. Russia annexed Crimea. Did UN attention to these crises benefit the US? Was the UN effective in responding to them?
Yeah, thank you, Felice, and thank you for inviting me to join you. You know, I'd like to start actually by picking up on something you opened with, which was describing the role of the American Jewish Committee in ensuring the centrality of human rights in the UN Charter. And the kind of cajoling and lobbying and coalition building, at least that I imagine AJC back then, still very much continues to this day. And I think, including on the issues you just mentioned, some of the work that I'm proudest of that we did at the United Nations and the Security Council specifically involved very much that same sort of cajoling and pushing and ensuring focus on humans as part of international peace and security, and human rights as part of international peace and security. I mean, I remember, and I'll tell the story briefly, I remember when I first arrived in New York to represent the United States on the Security Council, I took the Chinese ambassador to dinner. And at the dinner, over the course of, I think, dessert, I mentioned to him that the United States felt that the focus on nuclear issues in North Korea was obviously very important, but that we felt that it was time that the Security Council begin considering the human rights issues in North Korea as well. And recognizing that North Korea's weapon of mass destruction wasn't only its nuclear program, but was also the way it was treating its own people, putting hundreds of thousands of people in labor camps, forcing children to watch their parents be executed. And I remember the Chinese ambassador looking at me stone-faced and saying, Ambassador Pressman, are you sure the United States hasn't made a mistake and sent you to the wrong council, not the Security Council, but the UN Human Rights Council? And so, you know, that conversation and friendship and negotiation ultimately resulted in 2015, as Felice, I know you'll recall, with the United States forcing a vote in the Security Council chamber, a vote that we succeeded, and putting the issue of human rights in North Korea on the Security Council's agenda for the first time. And I think with respect to the issues that you referenced, whether it be the Russian aggression, invasion, and purported annexation of Crimea, or it be the context of ISIL and foreign terrorist fighters. In each of these dimensions, was the Security Council effective? And Syria, was the Security Council effective? Absolutely not. It was an abject failure. And why was it an abject failure? It's not the United Nations that was a failure. The United Nations is a collection of member states. It's the fact that on the Security Council, you had a permanent member with a veto power, the Russian Federation, who up until 2015 was prepared to use its veto to defend at all costs its ally, Bashar al-Assad. And after 2015 was actually an active participant in the armed conflict. So in that environment, against that milieu, for the United States to engage in the United Nations, we need to look for opportunities to still drive our agenda and our interests forward. And I think that work, if you look, we had similar problems with the Russian Federation in the context of Ukraine. And yet still, even though the Security Council itself was manifestly blocked from acting in an impactful way, we were able to take action in places like the General Assembly and convince some 100 countries to vote in favor of resolutions reaffirming the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and finding ways to drive our agenda and our interests forward, even when the institution itself, as my old boss, Madeleine Albright, mentioned at the beginning, may be in need of some refurbishment.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Negroponte, one of the issues at the United Nations has been the fact that there's an excessive amount of attention paid to issues dealing with Israel. The UN General Assembly takes up some 20 anti-Israel resolutions annually. Human Rights Council in Geneva has a permanent agenda item devoted solely to Israel. Security Council briefs on the Middle East, which means Israel, monthly. The list goes on. What more, if anything, could the US do to end this unfair obsession with Israel, which is unique among the 193 member states? And were you able to make a difference regarding anti-Israel and occasionally anti-Semitic behavior at the United Nations?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's certainly one that any United States permanent representative to the United Nations agonizes with during their tenure. That's been true for many years now, and it was not. My tenure was no exception. And you're absolutely right in how you characterized it. This sort of undue obsession with Israel by the membership of the United Nations. Well, we did quite a bit, I think. First of all, I believe I cast a couple of vetoes with respect to Security Council resolutions that I felt, and Washington felt, were completely unbalanced with respect to the state of Israel. I also established a sort of a practice, which some people even elevated in their rhetoric to calling the Negroponte doctrine, wherein if we were going to accuse, if Israel was going to be accused of some kind of untoward behavior with respect to violence or terrorism, then an equal effort had to be made to highlight Palestinian transgressions as well. We had to introduce some kind of balance into these resolutions and point the finger at some of their misbehavior. So I thought we fought pretty hard. In the General Assembly, it's really just so totally lopsided. Usually the votes of some of the resolutions that criticize Israel go by 185 to 3 or something like that. Ourselves and Israel and maybe some South Pacific nation. What I made an effort, a great effort, to try to get more abstentions in these General Assembly debates. So to at least try to move, if you have 2 degrees of separation, if you're voting against a resolution and someone else is in favor, you really have 2 degrees of separation. If you can at least get those voting for these anti-Israel elections, if you resolutions, get them to move to abstentions, that would be a good thing. And I worked very hard on the European Union, since they usually carried a block of some 35 to 37 votes. And sometimes we succeeded in doing that. And that was one of my short-term goals: increase the number of abstentions so that these victories, so-called, didn't look quite so lopsided. But I'm sure it remains a problem. It's a defect. I think it's something that that we just have to keep working on, and in the hope that someday we'll be able to shift the balance towards a more balanced perspective of the situation than has prevailed over these recent years. By the way, I just want to come back also to something that Ambassador Pressman said, that the UN is not some kind of abstract institution. It is the collection of member states. And sometimes we talk about the UN as if it were some isolated entity of some kind, sort of disembodied from ourselves, but it's not. We are the United Nations. And this is really the action of a group of member states. So I think we need to focus on bringing other member states over to our side, over to our point of view on various issues.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question on that, and for both of you, but Ambassador Pressman, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts on the previous question too. You know, the UN is one of the 4 members of the so-called Quartet, which has been a key negotiating vehicle for the Middle East peace process. In your view, considering all of the problems that have already been described about double standards towards Israel, do you think the UN still has a capacity to play a positive or a mediating role in this conflict? And what does the US really want to see from the UN in this regard?
Felice, shall I take that first, or is that
Why don't you begin?
So let me just offer sort of just a real note of agreement with Ambassador Negroponte on the need to engage and to combat the delegitimation campaign against Israel that's omnipresent, frankly, at the United Nations. I knew going in, but when I arrived, I was shocked by the level of anti-Israel sentiment, the intensity of anti-Semitism in some quarters. And again, it's a reflection of the member states and the countries and the state of the world, rather than a reflection of some inherent unique attribute of the United Nations, which is the building that houses them. And I think because of that, it's the argument for affirmative, intensive engagement, and for the United States to be involved and engaged in institutions to change minds, to build the kind of coalitions that Ambassador Negroponte was describing, and to combat the bias. And so, you know, instead of turning the United Nations and institutions like the Human Rights Council, for instance, into a prop in a political debate that's popular domestically, the United States needs to be in the room, needs to be forcing the so-called Human Rights Council to focus on a broad array of human rights issues, defend the interest of its allies, and advance US values. And you know, when I think about the work that we did, it required a lot, and I'm sure that Ambassador Negroponte and his team did, requires a lot of investment of time and resources, and the allocation of political capital to achieve those ends. So, you know, focusing the Human Rights Council and on productive areas, whether it be Burma or Syria or Sri Lanka or Iran, fighting against the proliferation of and the sort of fetishistic obsession with Israel that has existed throughout the Council's existence, but also affirmatively trying to build coalitions and the kinds of votes that would allow Israel to join in our administration, the Geneva-based Western European and others groups, the WEOG group. Subsequently to that, getting Israel admission to the so-called JewsCans group, the Japan, United States, Canada coalition. Getting Israel, the Israeli ambassador, for the first time elected to chair the powerful Sixth Committee, the legal committee of the United Nations, first time an Israeli official had done that. Fighting to get the United Nations to recognize Yom Kippur as an official UN holiday. I mean, these are symbolic, yes, but they're significant because precisely to John's point, they require member states to agree with you and to say, yes, this is something we're willing to invest in. So I just would offer that as a view that there are huge problems on this issue. And that is exactly why the United States needs to be in the room. Now, with respect to the Quartet, I would say the US role in advancing the two-state solution and negotiations between the two parties is critical. And I'm deeply concerned by the current lack of trust that has been emanated and produced by this administration's engagement in this process. The Quartet, the United Nations, the two-state solution is not going to come from statements or resolutions at the United Nations, period. It's going to come from negotiations. And the Quartet, I think, is a important way to multilateralize some of the US engagement. And when you look at the alternatives to the Quartet, including alternatives that emerged during my tenure on the council, where you have France, for instance, advancing its international peace conference, et cetera, I think that the interest of Israel, and certainly the US interest, are far more protected by virtue of continued US leadership in the process, but also using the Quartet as an important way to broaden the equities of interest and the process for peace.
Ambassador Negroponte.
Yeah, well, good for you, David, on this issue of the Israeli representative being chairman of the Sixth Committee. I mean, I guess I hadn't focused on the fact that had happened, but that's an important development, because when you think about it, you've got the two principal organs of the United Nations being the Security Council and then the General Assembly, but then the next most important organs of the UN are the 6 permanent committees, and to have the Israeli representative chairing one of them, especially the legal committee, that's an important development, and that's the kind of activity that we've just got to keep pressing on. I think you asked me about the Quartet originally and the prospects for peace there. I think David's covered it pretty much. I think that the key point, and I think that's been a bedrock policy for the US, at least during the time that I was working on these issues for the many years, was that this had to ultimately be a negotiated outcome. It wasn't going to be something that was really dictated from on high or from anywhere else. It's got to be negotiated. And so that is probably the best available format for accomplishing that. I think the process for the moment is dormant and sort of, on silent mode, but someday I think we can hope that these kinds of negotiations will resume.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to ask about your views on the US posture towards the UN today. This is for both of you. The current administration has declared its intention to withdraw from a number of UN bodies, most recently the World Health Organization. And it's generally taken a position towards the United Nations focused on what it calls asserting US sovereignty rather than promoting a rules-based international order. Some observers argue that this approach has empowered other countries, including those that don't agree with or support US values, countries like Russia and China. Do you think that the US has become a less effective venue for the realization of US interests as a result of this shift? And do you think the shift towards unilateralism is a wise decision? Perhaps we could start with Ambassador Pressman.
Yeah, Felice, I don't think my answer will surprise you. I think that the way this administration is engaging with the world generally, but with the UN in particular, is extreme. And let me be just really plain about this. The reason the US engages at the UN is not out of some ideology. It's not because we view the UN as sort of this kumbaya collection of countries where we can all get along. It's because we can use the UN to advance our strategic and national security interests, and we can use the UN to advance our values. So when this administration uses things, you mentioned the World Health Organization, is there a lot to criticize about the World Health Organization? The World Health Organization's response to this pandemic, by virtue of which we're all having this important conversation on this day virtually? there's a lot to criticize, for sure. Does this administration have some other plan for how to structure global conversation and norms and response with respect to this pandemic or others, short of continued participation and funding of the WHO? If it does, I'm unaware of it. And, they seem to be struggling enough with the domestic response. So it just, when the US leaves the room, does the UN become less effective? Absolutely, because the fact of the matter is that the United States and the United States leadership on global issues is indispensable. And there's no other country in the world, I continue to believe this, and I'll let Ambassador Negroponte speak for himself, that can set the agenda and drive global coalitions in the way that the United States of America can. And the threats we're confronting, that we have been confronting as a country over a long time, whether it be foreign terrorist fighters going to ISIL, weapons of mass destruction, refugee flows, these are threats that we cannot deal with by ourselves, that we need to bring others along with us. And so if you have a go at it alone approach, then explain to me how we're going to deal with foreign terrorist fighters and in terrorist organizations who are traveling from every country in the world. Explain to us how we're going to deal with weapons of mass destruction, how we're going to deal with global pandemics. The UN is a reflection of who we are. We have a choice to make as a country. Do we want to build global coalitions around the agenda that most effectively protects our interests and advance national security? Or do we want others to take that space at the United Nations and its institutions and build it around theirs? I know the choice to me is very clear, and the posture of receiving American leadership, I think motivated by an idea that that's politically popular at home, is really, really unfortunate. These are issues of national security. These aren't sort of political devices to message to constituencies in a domestic election.
Thank you. Ambassador Negroponte, you've been Director of National Intelligence, you've been Deputy Secretary of State. The same way or differently?
Do I feel the same way or differently? Well, I don't know if I could say it any better than Ambassador Pressman just did. So I want to say, first of all, I agree with everything he just said. Secondly, it's kind of interesting. We're sort of in the room and out of the room at the same time. The rhetoric from our leadership is definitely sort of out of the room, outside of the room kind of rhetoric, and wants to dissociate us in one way or another from the international community through this nationalistic sentiment, I suppose, and then also the president's efforts to appeal to his own political base. On the other hand, I don't think either the American people or the Congress are going to let us completely leave the room. When the State Department sends up our budget, proposing dramatic cuts in our foreign assistance or in assistance to the United Nations, Congress immediately restores it. And I think there's still strong sentiment in this country, and public opinion polls would appear to bear this out, that the American people believe fundamentally in the importance of international cooperation to solve international problems. And where else? I mean, of course, there are many different ways of going about this, but the UN itself has a host of organizations that deal with this very issue of how to cooperate together, whether it's the UNICEF or the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN Development Program, or the UN World Food Program. And we are usually the principal funder of each and every one of these organizations. Now, the president said we're going to withdraw from the World Health Organization. I don't think that really makes much sense. And if there's an issue that calls for international collaboration, it's dealing with a global pandemic. I mean, it would seem to me that the issues of climate change and pandemics are sort of poster boy issues for international cooperation. You just can't handle them all by yourself. So I think we'll end up being obliged to come back to that position, but that doesn't mean we're not going to continue to hear this kind of noisy rhetoric coming out of the White House that, frankly, is contrary, I believe, to the interests of the United States of America.
Thank you, Ambassador. Next week, the UN, I think on Tuesday, the Security Council is going to take up the issue of Iran, and in particular, with regard to the nuclear issue. We also see Iran playing a dangerous and destabilizing role throughout the Middle East, in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, etc. The government continues to commit gross human rights violations against its people, despite the UN's long engagement on this aspect of its behavior. What do you see as the most effective way for the US to combat the many threats posed by Iran and to promote more effective promotion of human rights for Iran's people? Can the UN play realistically a role in advancing any of these objectives?
Yeah.
We could begin with Ambassador Negroponte. Reverse the order.
All right. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to achieve compliance with the different UN Security Council resolutions that have been passed with respect to Iran in regard to its nuclear and to its missile programs. I happen, for one, to be somebody who does not believe that the Iran agreement was such a good deal. I didn't have heartburn over it, but I do think that it had some shortcomings, and I think it ought to be improved. I don't think there should be a time limit to it. I don't think there should be exceptions for their missile programs. I think they get a free pass after 7 or 8 years, something like that. So I think that Iran's feet need to be held to the fire. The issue I have with the administration's policies is that it's heaped these sanctions on Iran, but I'm not sure that they have as clear an idea of what the negotiating outcome is that they're trying to achieve. And I've never seen, notwithstanding all of these pressures that we're putting on Iran, it result in some kind of resumed discussion. And that is what I would like to see happen. But I think the ball is sort of in our court and Iran's court as far as the issue moving forward, and not the Security Council as a whole.
Ambassador Pressman.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with most of what Ambassador Negroponte said. Look, Iran's very dangerous. We can't allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. The question is how we prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Is that something we're going to do in partnership with our allies, or is it something we're going to do unilaterally? And I know my preference, and that is, there's a lot to criticize about the JCPOA. I agree that it didn't include human rights, it didn't include ballistics, it didn't deal with the terrorism, the multidimensional aspects, Felice, that you mentioned in your question. But the reality was, at that time, with respect to the nuclear program, it achieved the most significant, verifiable way to deter and stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And that's important. Now, what the administration has replaced it with, to Ambassador Negroponte's point, with the sanctions, they've replaced the JCPOA with a policy that's described as maximum pressure. But in order to bring maximum pressure, you need more than just U.S. sanctions. You need enforcement. You need monitoring. You need your allies with you to achieve that kind of pressure. And so what is the appropriate next step? I mean, I agree with Ambassador Negroponte. The appropriate next step is for the U.S. meaningfully to engage with our partners and allies, and even some of our adversaries, about how best to contain and control the threat out of Iran on the nuclear issues, but also on the other issues that you pose. I mean, it's not dissimilar, actually, to where we started about North Korea, human rights, and international peace and security. Like, dealing with Iran, the nuclear issues are of paramount importance, of course, but there's a whole range of issues that need to be tackled, and that can only happen with aggressive U.S. leadership in partnership with others. And right now, I think we're alone, and that should be concerning to everyone.
Could I just jump back in here and just say that
Please.
What gave some of us pause when we negotiated the JCPOA was not so much the agreement itself as the fact of what it just failed to deal with. And David mentioned that. I mean, if you live in the Middle East, you're concerned about Iran. There may be some concern about their nuclear capabilities, no doubt, and above all in Israel. But if you live in Lebanon, or if you live in Iraq, or you live in Gaza, or you live in, I mean, it's their activities on the ground. It's the IRGC, it's the Revolutionary Guards, it's the militias that they support throughout the region. They are a threat on the ground in the Middle East, and in Yemen as well. So we have this really situation of considerable tension in the region. Basically, Iran on one side and much of the rest of the Middle East on the other. Not necessarily all, but much of it. And you know, what's going to be done to diffuse that situation? So in a way, they negotiated in the Obama administration the nuclear part, but the other part was really left completely undealt with. And it seems to me that requires a lot more thought going forward as to how we're going to advance those interests.
Yeah, I would just completely agree with most of that. I would argue, though, Ambassador Negroponte, that those issues, while completely unaddressed, perhaps in the context of the JCPOA, were not completely unaddressed with respect to our broader diplomacy, including activities on the Security Council in response to activities that violated arms embargoes and what have you. But yes, I mean, by all means, like you can't be focused exclusively on the nuclear issue for precisely the reasons you're describing. And should it give everyone great pause that these threats continue to unfold and unravel, and Iran continues to pose the danger it does, and that the United States is alone in countering it in many respects? Yeah, I agree.
And the United Nations has a big role or a small role or no role in dealing with some of these issues. That was really the thrust of my question.
Well, I don't think they're going to have a big role unless the great powers can reach a closer meeting of the minds as to what would constitute effective action. I think as long as Russia and China, ourselves, and in this case, even Europe, don't really have a common vision of how to go about this, I think it's hard to find that role for the United Nations, but it does speak to one other issue, which I would favor. And here we are talking about the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. This is a subject that is worthy of high-level meetings between the P5, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. I mean, when I was younger, we used to have frequent meetings of P5 foreign ministers to discuss, just to sit down and talk about the problems of the world, even P5 heads of state. And I think there needs to be a bit more of that kind of diplomacy so that we can talk through some of these global problems and regional problems. More than we're doing now, where everybody seems to be just sort of listening to their own voices.
The UN has been following a pattern introduced by the British ambassador when she was there, Karen Pierce. They call them the SOFA meetings, where at least the P5 sit around and try to talk about some of these issues. She's gone. Who knows if it will continue in any way. I think we're now running a little longer than I had anticipated, and I have to turn the meeting back to Daniel so that we can be sure to get some of the questions that are being submitted by those who are participating in the meeting. We'll have a chance to come back at the end on this. So Daniel, it's over to you.
Thank you, Felice. Our first question comes from Leah Pritzker in Seattle, Washington, who asked, considering all the problems U.S. officials have cited about double standards and bias of the world body towards Israel, does the UN still have the capacity to play a positive or mediating role in this conflict? Ambassador Negroponte?
Yes, I think they do. And I think you've got to make some kind of a distinction between the people, the Secretariat of the United Nations and some of the very good people who work for them, as distinct for some of these sort of sweeping political resolutions. The effectiveness of the UN Secretariat, and if they were playing some kind of mediating role, depends very much on who the special representatives of the Secretary General are. And there have been some absolutely outstanding ones in recent years, whether it was Lakhdar Brahimi or Sergio Vera de Mello, or you can go back, all the way back, I guess, to Ralph Bunche, if you want to go back to the beginning of UN history. So that, they can do it. And I think that if given the chance and the proper guidance from the Security Council and the membership, absolutely they can do it.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Sylvia Havlin in San Francisco, who asks, has the U.S. benefited from withdrawal from the Human Rights Council? And I'll add a second question from Jerry Yonover, who asks, how can the UN the UN Human Rights Council be fair and balanced, considering some of its members are the world's worst offenders? Ambassador Pressman?
Yes, thank you for the question. No, the United States has not benefited from withdrawing from the Human Rights Council. The folks who have benefited from the United States withdrawing from the Human Rights Council are exactly the human rights abusers that the second questioner mentions. And you're right. I mean, the Human Rights Council in some ways is better known for a composition that includes some of the world's grossest human rights violators than the reverse. But that's not a reality to be denied. Again, I just want to emphasize we shouldn't be ideological about our engagement. The reason the US needs to be at the Human Rights Council is precisely so we can focus the council on real pressing human rights issues in a fair and effective way. And when we leave the room, then the very people that the second questioner mentions, some of the world's most egregious human rights abusers, dominate the narrative, create the norms, and set the agenda. That doesn't serve the United States' interests. It doesn't serve Israel's interests, and it shouldn't be a position that the UN or the US finds itself in. I want the US in the room.
There's a follow-up question from Lucille Rodstein on Zoom, who asks, if there's a new administration next year, will it be possible for the US to return to bodies that they've withdrawn from? Ambassador Negroponte?
No, I don't see why not. I mean, I don't think any of these steps are irrevocable, and often they're done for political effect of one kind or another. I kind of have mixed feelings about the Human Rights Council, only because of what Ambassador Pressman mentioned, which is that sometimes you wake up and you find out that one of the world's most egregious human rights violators happens to be the chair country of the institution. And it just seems to me there are just no standards for membership other than being a member state. I mean, I don't know how you deal with that. Can you dictate that only democracies need apply? But that's probably not the kind of standard that would be acceptable within the United Nations organization as a whole. On the other hand, why should Libya or Iran or Venezuela or whoever be chairman of that particular council? It seems to me that maybe people could come up with some minimal requirement that has to be met before you can stand for chairmanship of the council.
Can I just jump in here on the Libya mention? I completely agree, by the way, with the concern about.
It really makes it very hard. It's hard to explain to an American audience.
But you mentioned Libya, and I think about, even though you have often sort of a rogues gallery of members on the council, during the Obama administration, we were able to get the Human Rights Council to expel Gaddafi's Libya from the Human Rights Council. And the only reason that happened is because of assertive U.S. leadership of framing an issue of something being important. So we're not going to solve all of these problems, but I do think through engagement we can make progress on things that are important to us.
Next question comes from Melanie Nelkin in Atlanta. It says, despite its role as the UN body responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Security Council has been unable to take timely action on mass atrocity situations. This year is the 15th anniversary of the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine, and not all elected members of the council are, quote, friends of this doctrine. Can we expect that existing political divisions within member states will prevent the Security Council from reaffirming its commitment to preventing mass atrocities, human rights abuses, and genocide in countries like Myanmar, Syria, and South Sudan? Ambassador Negroponte?
Well, pardon me for being somewhat of a skeptic here. I don't think that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's anything in international law or doctrine that encrusts the concept of the responsibility to protect. I think that's a policy that was advocated by some people in response to the Rwanda situation. But I think in the end, it comes down to a pragmatic, case-by-case approach to whatever situations might arise. Because I don't think there's anybody who's going to say that we, as an international community and as the United Nations, must intervene in every single atrocity-ridden situation that occurs in various countries around the world. We'd be all over the place, way over our heads, without the necessary resources to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Just take the Eastern Congo, for example, just to cite one very notorious example, but there are atrocities and human rights violations on large scale being carried out in many, many different places around the world. So ultimately, it comes down to the merits of the case as made in the context of the particular time and circumstances in which it's being debated. And I think the general notion of responsibility to protect is good as far as it goes, but whether it's going to be applied by the Security Council to a particular situation has to be debated at that point in time within the Security Council itself.
Could I just comment on that as well, which is only to offer that I think that the responsibility to protect doctrine and the idea behind it should be understood as something broader than just the kind of intervention that Ambassador Negroponte is discussing, which raises a whole host of issues, chief amongst them the ones he discussed. But the responsibility to protect doctrine is, at least as I understand it, is fundamentally about expanding the aperture of the tools that can be used to respond to situations in which civilians may be endangered. And indeed, the United Nations and the Security Council in particular have a range of tools short of sending in armed forces into a situation where there's a potential mass atrocity or genocide, where they can protect civilians. And so I think there's actually more common ground even on this issue to be found by early engagement by the UN and by the US on situations of potential mass atrocity and genocide, without necessarily jumping to the conclusion of, do we need to send in the Marines or do we need to send in a peacekeeping mission?
That, David, would involve anticipating some of these things, wouldn't it? Okay, it involves a surveillance system and everything else that permits you to understand these situations well before they develop to past the boiling point, right?
That's exactly right, and that's why I think
you can do that. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, this I think, you know, what's interesting is this issue is actually surprisingly bipartisan in nature, at least historically it has been, and the kind of surveillance system or monitoring and early warning detection that you're referencing is exactly the kind of architecture that a responsible, in my view, US government, but really any government, needs to have internalized, so that you are monitoring for, because often these are situations that are emerging in countries that aren't, you know, at the top of our strategic priorities list. And so the bandwidth of senior officials like yourself in government is limited. And so you need mechanisms so that you're monitoring and looking for early indicators of potential atrocity and able to engage early enough so you're not faced with the decision of, do we send in the Marines or not?
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question that perhaps both of you can answer before turning it over to you, Felice. You may also wish to weigh in as well, but this is coming from a lot of our members that are asking, what role can civil society and non-governmental organization like AJC, for example, play with regards to the United Nations?
Oh, you want me to start? I mean,
sure, Ambassador Negroponte, please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have the good example of the AJC all the way back to 1945. So that's a good place to start. I think there are almost unlimited possibilities for civil society to play a role in one way or another, whether it's from a policy point of view, vis-a-vis the actions of the Security Council or the General Assembly, to the matter of how to effectively apply and administer humanitarian assistance through one of the specialized humanitarian agencies of the United Nations. I think this is a case where, literally the world is their oyster. The only thing I would ask is that people be focused in what they try to do and try to know their brief very well so that they can be supportive in an effective way rather than just blanketing the organization with criticism or unrealistic advice.
Just briefly, I agree with what John has said, but historically, Russia and China in particular have not been very favorably disposed to having NGO participation, or certain NGOs at least participation in UN committees and formats and what have you. And the US has historically been a champion of it. And I think that one of the things that civil society and NGOs can do, which is very much in the spirit of what Felice and David Harris and the AJC have done over the years, is really stand up for the proposition that voices, non-governmental voices, are actually not only a good thing to have, but essential to the policymaking process that takes place in international and multilateral mechanisms. Because in the absence of that form of advocacy, and in the absence of the US standing up for the NGO community and the NGO voice and civil society voice at the United Nations, I don't think that there's much appetite among some of the permanent members of the Security Council to protect that role. So what can you do? You can continue to be loud and tailored in the way that Ambassador Negroponte suggested, but insist that the United States stand up for the important role of NGOs in this process.
I would just add briefly, NGOs have been around since the founding conference. And in fact, one of the things that was accomplished by AJC, in addition to the human rights materials, Article 71 of the Charter, which provides for NGOs to be part of the organization. What do? They set agendas. They bring in information, witnesses, and on the ground information that might not arise otherwise. They bring in new perspectives, and they conduct advocacy. All of those are needed, and it sometimes jolts the UN member states to take action in ways that they wouldn't have done otherwise. So it's a tremendously important part of the organization's activity, and NGOs are I would say, indispensable part of the organization's work.
Felice, I'm going to keep it with you so that I think we want to be respectful of everyone's time and wrap up.
Well, I'd like to I'd like to thank both ambassadors for joining us, but I'd also like to give them one last opportunity. We have a couple of minutes left to share your broad thoughts on the US-UN relationship on this 75th anniversary. Can we reasonably aspire for the UN to be able to live up to the promise of the Charter, securing international peace and security, protecting human rights, and addressing global problems like climate change? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I think most of us professional diplomats are trained to sort of deal with, to play the cards we're dealt and deal with situations on a realistic basis. But within that context, I think I'm pretty hopeful that we can revive international cooperation through the United Nations. I think the key point at this juncture, certainly within the context of American politics, is the value of international cooperation. I think we have a president, sorry, who is critical of that, who thinks we can go it alone, who promotes nationalistic sentiment. And I think that's the question. Is there value in international cooperation? I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. And the United Nations is an important vehicle for achieving that. I think all the rest is detail, but I think that if we want to tackle the major problems facing the world, whether they're pandemics or climate change or conflict around the world, we're going to have to find better ways to cooperate internationally. So yes, I'm hopeful that we can do that and that we'll come back to the realization that the UN is one of the best available vehicles available to us to accomplish that.
Yeah, I obviously agree wholeheartedly. We're confronting threats that are unimaginable, that are not unilateral threats. They're threats that can't be dealt with even by a country as great and as important and as powerful as the United States alone. And if we want to succeed, then we need to bring others along with us. And the United Nations in particular provides a uniquely opportunistic place and platform for the US to build the kind of coalitions that serve our interests. So you don't have to be even an optimist to believe that what Ambassador Negroponte and I are describing advances US interests. You don't even have to, you can be completely realpolitik about it and look at the fact that the way the UN is organized allows the US to achieve things that are important to the United States. And there is no substitute for it. And can we get back to where we once were? I certainly hope so, but it's going to require a political level commitment and a lot of work. And that's work that I think we can't afford not to do.
Thank you again, both of you, very much for joining us for this. And Dan, it's back to you.
Thank you, Felice, and thank you, Ambassador Pressman and Ambassador Negroponte, for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and for showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will feature a conversation with Greek politician Margarita Skinas, Vice President of the European Commission and European Commissioner for Promoting the European Way of Life. Vice President Skinas will be in conversation with AJC CEO David Harris for a wide-ranging discussion on issues related to European anti-Semitism, migration and asylum, the EU fight against terrorism and radicalization, and other issues of concern. This program will take place on Monday, June 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you will join us. Thank you again, and please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.